Welcome back, NAS 4932. This is Module 3, lecture video part 2 on language description. If you have not already seen part 1 on language documentation, pause this, go back, watch that, and this is the follow-up to that. So what is a language description? So I have some definitions that I'm going to read to you and then explain. So, in the study of language, description or descriptive linguistics is the work of objectively analyzing and describing how language is actually used or how it was used in the past by a speech community. So, let's talk about this. So, language description is, and it says here, the work of objectively analyzing. So we're using a methodology, we're using techniques, we're using a scientific method to analyze and describe how language is used. This is different than language prescription, which is telling people how language should be used. Okay, and to break that down a little bit more, prescription is correcting someone when they say who instead of whom. Prescription is telling someone that it's incorrect to use the word ain't. Prescription is having a set way to pronounce every word. For example, if you tell someone or if you believe that it is pronounced fire and not far, then that is language prescription. Language description is removed from any of those right and wrong, correct, incorrect, grammatical, ungrammatical ideas, and it's really just describing how language is being used by a group of people at that time, or looking at how they may have used it in the past. For example, people in Shakespeare's time spoke very differently than people now. We can still understand them, but we do not speak in that way. And so you could compare English now to English then, and that would be language description. So all academic research in linguistics is descriptive. If you took classes, linguistics classes, you would be doing language description. If you got a degree in linguistics and became a professor, your entire career would be language description. Like all other scientific disciplines, it seeks to describe reality without the bias of preconceived ideas of how it ought to be. And that's, again, defining description separate from prescription. Modern descriptive linguistics is based on a structural approach to language. So linguists believe that there is a overarching structure to all language, and the examples of language that we have through documentation either support that structure or oppose it, and if they oppose it, then we change the theory, we change the structure to include that. This type of linguistics utilizes different methods in order to describe a language, such as basic data collection and different types of elicitation methods. So that descriptive linguistics is tied to documentation, language documentation, because without the documentation, then we can't describe what we're seeing. And those basic data collection, that's things like recordings and transcription and all the other ways in the language documentation lecture that we talked about that you can collect language. So language description, in a nutshell, it's a scientific way of explaining how language is actually used. So why is it important? Natural linguistic descriptions provide information about major trends and atypical behaviors present in data sets, but they also preserve information about their representativity by means of adverbs indicating the extent to which the trends are characteristic of the whole data sets. Okay, let's talk about this. So, by describing how language is actually used, we can find trends in languages and pull out times when something abnormal happens. So, for example, if you surveyed 100 people and asked them how to pronounce a certain word, you could then analyze from the documentation, the 100 times that you had people pronounce this word and you recorded them, any variations. And so you could decide if variations are typical. So if is it something that people who are from a certain region pronounce this word this way and people from another region pronounce it this way, or are there atypical behaviors? Is there someone or people in your 100 elicitations, your 100 examples of the word that just say it different and you can't really find a reason? So then you can look at, maybe does this person, are they older? Do they have all their teeth? Is this person, were they sick and maybe congested and sounded extra nasally? Or were they chewing gum? Or do they seem to have some kind of pronunciation issue like a lisp or things like that? So by looking at language documentation and describing what we see in a systematic way, we can find things that are typical and things that are atypical. And then here where it talks about the adverbs indicating the extent, so we can say that in our group, people always said it this way, people often said it this way, people sometimes said it this way, people rarely said it this way. And those are the adverbs where we can quantify changes and say if they're common changes or not common changes. And this is true of more than just pronunciation. This is grammatical forms. This is syntax, the order that people put their words. This is all parts of language. It's even the intonation in someone's voice. So have you ever heard someone speak where it sounds like they're asking a question? And like, I went to the store and it was closed, and that kind of like rising at the end. You could, study that and see how many people out of 100, 1,000 people speak that way. See if you can find some commonalities with that. Is it women who do it more than men? Is it young people that do it more than older people? And find out, is this a regional thing, or is this a age thing? Is this a class thing? Is this a gender thing? Or is it a new variation of the language? So linguistic description allows you to really dive into how language is used and why. Okay, so really, in the end, language description is really more for the linguists than the community. That's not to say that community members cannot produce incredible linguistic descriptions. That is not what I'm saying at all. However, community members tend to be more interested in using language documentation to do things with the language, like make teaching materials, to archive cultural information, to produce certain things. Whereas linguists care a little bit more. They care about those things just as much. Trust me, my whole career is those other things. But we also care about describing the language and contributing to the greater knowledge of linguistics. Linguistic description is vital to preserve unique linguistic features, though. So it's really important that it's also done, whether it's by the community or by a linguist, because sometimes a speaker is less likely to notice the unique things about their language, where someone learning the language or someone who's actively studying the language tends to notice those things more. So as an example, I used to teach ESL to students at OU, and it was really hard for them to pick up adverbs. things like in, or I'm sorry, not adverbs, prepositions. Things like in, on, under, next to, between, besides, toward, things like that, with, within, without. It was not impossible for them, but if they were going to make a mistake, that is often where they were going to make a mistake, especially depending what language was their first language, because not all languages use prepositions in the same way, and very few have as many as we have. And they would ask me, teacher, how do you know to use that there? And it was really hard for me to give them a rule or say, you know, whenever you see this word, you're always going to use this preposition. Sometimes I just had to say, I don't know. I just know that that's the right one. And a lot of speakers can tell you that something is correct or incorrect, but can't always describe why. With language description, you look for those rules and those unique features, and you're able to better describe the rule behind what's happening instead of just saying, but I just know this is right, if that makes sense. Okay, so there's examples of language description that I'm going to show you in this presentation. Grammars, a language sketch, phonetic transcription, rule-governed behavior, corpus linguistics, and language reconstruction. So let's jump into some of these. So all of these pink underlines here are links. So if you click here, you're going to see a grammar of the Kamzo language, which is a language of Papua New Guinea. You can download the PDF for free of this grammar if you want to check it out in detail. I have ready to go, though, a grammar of the Potawatomi language right here. As you can see, a grammar, this grammar was created by someone who, Hunter Thompson Lockwood, who submitted this as his final paper to get his PhD in linguistics in 2017. A grammar is a intense, usually a book, that describes every single linguistic aspect of a particular language. So, for example, I'm going to kind of scoot ahead to the table of contents here. So, in the beginning of his grammar, he talks about, you know, the name of the language, other people who have worked on the language linguistically, demographics and history. Corpus is like where he got his information, so different text, different sources. And then it goes straight into the sound system. So he has a little bit on spelling and an overview of the sounds, then talks about every consonant, talks about every vowel, talks about syllables, talks about nasalization, so when air tends to come out more of your nose, palatalization, when your tongue is further back in the mouth, then kind of summarizes all of that, and then in chapter 3 goes into morphology. Morphology is words and the parts of words, like prefixes and suffixes. So he talks about nouns and verbs, pronouns, particles, prenouns, preverbs. And so as you can see, there's at least a page to a couple pages on each of these. Goes into more word structure right here. The components of words. Chapter 4 is just about nouns and the things that you can do to nouns. Chapter 5 is about verbs and all the things that you can do to verbs, and talking about like animate, intransitive, transitivity. Transitivity is how many people are participants in a sentence. So like a transitive, so non-transitive, transitive, ditransitive. So like how many people are a part of a sentence or things. So then chapter 6 goes into syntax and semantics. Syntax is like word order. Semantics is meaning. So he talks all about word order, talks about different clauses that are part of a sentence. Talks about questions, has a whole lot lot about questions, talks about tense, so past tense, future tense, aspect, modality, evidentiality. That means you have to mark somewhere. I'm going to guess the verb. Robert can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to guess that you mark on the verb how you know information. Do you know it firsthand? Is it something that everybody knows, like the sun rises in the east? We all know that. Or is it something that you witnessed? Is it something that you heard secondhand? Depending on what Potawatomi requires when it comes to evidentiality, it could be any of those things. I honestly don't know. I know that in Turkish, the Turkish language, all of those things and more can be on the verb. Quantifying expressions, so we have like always, through, never, none, nobody, a few, and so all of that. And then syntax and semantics, a little discourse, and then there's some stories that have been included. So this is a 250 plus page book about every single aspect about the grammar of the Potawatomi language. And I'm scrolling here because I want to show you that it's full of examples. It's full of so like here's when you have the ya sound, and they're showing words that have the ya sound in the language. Down here we're talking about here they're talking about animate versus inanimate nouns. These are noun classes, and so they're giving examples of each one, and then giving a little bit of a discussion about it and why and where they got this information. And it looks like related languages, how they also see that. So grammar is a really intense descriptive tool. A language sketch, on the other hand, is a light version of a grammar. If you were in the Intro to Native American Languages class, or if you take it in the future, you write a language sketch throughout the course in 4 or 5 pieces and turn that in as your final. And so I have a example here of a language sketch that a student did in a past class about the Kiowa language. And so it follows the same program, the same like progress, but this is only like 9 pages compared to 250. So here's a little paragraph about who the Kiowa people are, a map that shows where they're traditionally from, a paragraph that talks about the linguists who have worked on this language previously, and then we jump into a sound chart and a couple paragraphs discussing each of the sounds, a paragraph for consonants and one for vowels. Then we talk about the structure of the words in the language. And here it's talking about noun classes. And then it goes on to talk about verbs right here. And then sociolinguistics, so ways that Kiowa people use language. And so this person decided to write about jokes. Kiowa, there's a lot of words that sound very similar, and so that allows you to make puns. And so they talk about different puns in the language. It goes on to talk about the language family, so what languages are related to the Kiowa language and what that looks like. Then talking about contact between Kiowa and specifically the Uto-Aztecan languages, and then some examples here. Cognate list is a list of words in related languages, so you can compare and see if they're similar. So we have the English, the Kiowa, and the Tiwa. Tiwa is related to Kiowa, and Toa. Toa is more closely related to Tiwa than it is to Kiowa, but kind of comparing them here. And then citations. So as you can see, a language sketch, like I said, is just a light version of a grammar, and usually uses a grammar as its source. Phonetic transcription. So if you follow these links, you can see examples of phonetic transcription, phonological rules, and grammatical rules. I have a couple here. So Here is an example of phonetic transcription. So this is using the International Phonetic Alphabet to write the pronunciation of words. And theoretically, a person who knows the International Phonetic Alphabet could, whether they spoke English or not, could read this and be able to pronounce perfectly each one of these words, because they're not really reading the word, but they're reading and using the sounds. So here's an example of analyzing the actual sounds of words. Related to phonetics is phonology, and that's the study of how sounds change. So here are some examples of some phonological rules. I know this looks really like gobbledygook, or almost maybe even like a math formula, but a trained linguist knows how to write a rule where here they're saying a vowel becomes nasal when it is found in front of or before a nasal consonant. So if you have a word that ends in an N or an M, it's very likely that your vowel is going to become nasalized like the consonant before it, and this is called assimilation. Here, the second rule says a vowel becomes nasal when it is right before the end of a word. So that's not as common, but here, are examples of phonological rules. And so you can analyze how sounds change when they're in words and sentences and write rules about that. Corpus linguistics is I apologize, my dog is sneezing a lot over here. Corpus linguistics is the study of large bodies of writing in a language. So the whole AI revolution that we're going through right now, these computers like OpenAI and Google have been trained to look at everything on the internet that they can find that's written in English or French and Spanish and analyze it so that they can answer questions in a chat box, because they've learned common questions, what the response to those are. And they're able to write essays and things like that because they've read millions and millions of essays and they know what an essay should look like. If you have a PhD in corpus linguistics and know how to program, you can become a very, very rich person. Because Google and all those companies are looking for people who focus on corpus linguistics to help them improve AI. Language reconstruction is when languages that are no longer spoken are rebuilt based off of language documentation. So an example would be, we all know that French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, these are all daughter languages to Latin, which is no longer spoken. But we can use what we know about these languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, to reconstruct what Latin probably sounded like and how words were created. Now, because Latin has a lot of written information about it, like the Roman people wrote a lot of stuff down, we have more data to go off of, but you can reconstruct languages from languages that weren't written. It's just you don't have as much to be able to check. So, for example, let's say you are revitalizing a language and you either don't have any speakers or you have very few speakers and they can't remember the word for everything. Let's say they couldn't remember the word for persimmon, right? The fruit. Well, what you could do is you could look at related languages and see if they have a word for persimmon and that's been recorded, and if so, either borrow that word or, using what you can reconstruct of your language, make your best guess of what that word would have been. if you don't have a written record, it's hard to know 100% if that's what the word would have been, but it's better than not having a word for it. Another example would be, so we know that Creek and Choctaw and Chickasaw and Seminole are all related. They're Muskogean languages. Well, what language did the Muskogean people speak 5,000 years ago when, instead of being in their individual groups of Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, Alabama, Appalachia, all the different groups, what did they speak when they were one group all living together? And so what you can do is you can take examples of words and grammar that you know in Choctaw, in Chickasaw, in Creek, in Seminole, in Hitchiti, in Miccosukee, all of the Muskogean languages, and put them together and kind of build backwards and see, like, what do they have in common, what is different, and kind of build back a theory of what the Muskogean language sounded like and how it was used back then. Again, because there's not a written record, you're never going to be perfect on that, but you can make some really good educated guesses because languages tend to change in structured ways all over the world. And that has to be human nature because we see all over the world that languages tend to change in very similar ways. So we can apply what we know of how languages change to that and make some really good educated guesses. Okay, so those more examples of language description were the things that I showed you, like the Potawatomi grammar. Here is a little bit of information about describing morphology. So morphology is words and the parts of words. And so here we have in English how words are put together. So we have the word unpleased. And we know that please is kind of like the root of this word. And it gets a un added to the beginning. And it gets a ed, which we have to drop one of the e's because we can't have two. Because please already ends in an e. And so now we have unpleased. And then we have displeased, pleasing. So morphology is the study of how words change with prefixes and suffixes to slightly change their meaning. So to make it past tense, to make it present tense, to make something a noun like pleasure, to make something an adjective like pleasant, to make something an adverb like unpleasantly. And so what do we have to do to words to do that? And the rules in every language is slightly different. Morphology, linguistic description, is kind of describing how words work in a language. All right. So this is everything that I have on linguistic description. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out. And remember, if you haven't watched the first video about linguistic documentation, you need to go back and do that. All right, bye.